Okay, this is another conglomeration of sacred geometry and showing its connections to basically everything. Sacred numbers are embedded in everyday phenomenon, from the idea of a 7-Eleven, which we'll show later, 666, the number 13. People have superstitions about certain numbers that go along with this too, but then there are other numbers that are showing that they had advanced mathematics to the point that it's bewildering. In ancient times, seemingly going back to before Egypt and before Samaria, which was before Egypt, to a time before writing was even existing, and people were already able to do extreme mathematics openly. It can only be thought that way because as soon as Sumerians show up on the page of history, they seemingly have this sacred geometry. It's been shown over and over, and some of these strange little tablets that they found that had all these numbers on them that they put in another box and dictated as this is people counting grain or doing things along that line. Some of those we found now are not. I've done a recent video and an old video right after it came out that somebody going through one of these boxes ended up finding something that looked like they were doing math somehow, but they couldn't figure it out or understand it. And of course, the Sumerians did something on an ancient base 60, where 6 was more important and 12. And if you don't think that that's in effect still, we still have 12 months in a year, 12 hours in a day, 12 hours in a night. Jesus had 12 disciples. It's written in everything that we know of. In fact, Randall Carlson says here, number and symbolism and form are universal regardless of the spoken tongue. I've shown in other videos where from Sanskrit to ancient Irish and all in between, all these different languages that you can think of are actually based on Proto-Indo-European linguistics from the Wayback Machine. It seemed like they carried on that. They carried on cattle. They carried on horseback, which led to our modern cars, which we still refer to as having horsepower. But it goes deeper than that. Mathematics, time itself. This is an incredible showing here, and by conglomerating these together, shows you just a portion of the breadth of what sacred geometry contains. This symbol that you see in the center of the page is Metatron's cube. I've shown in a recent video, whether it came out before or after this, where there is a seed of life, the flower of life, and so on, and it carries through to this idea of Metatron, and people have figured out, well, that's in the Bible, and that talks about this thing that's going to happen, and what is it? Well, it's Metatron. It's a geometric shape. Like so many times I've shown you that there are secrets found written in the stars, written in sacred geometry and numbers. Ancient tales, which when you're supposed to read it, you were supposed to have known the ancient tale, and it's Aesop's fable, if you will, but then seeing something else that they atone in the Bible to a reality situation and trying to make another showing. Let's get into this here with Randall Carlson. Now, this is going to be a multi-parter, and I'll probably record it even in portions where I'll put out 2 or 3 portions each weekend until we go through this and can consume this one thing, which is a 2-hour video, but due to breaking in, just like I'm doing now, it's going to take much longer than that, but you'll get to understand the breadth and the extent of sacred geometry and what it contains even to this day. Let's begin.
Really pondering the fact that there's actually deep symbolism hidden within them. We measure our life in terms of days, 24 hours, referred to as a tropical or solar day. And it turns out that 24 of these hours are 1,440 minutes. This is one of the key numbers within the ancient canon of numerical cosmology that the ancients used to basically design and create their world.
This is what the world is created out of. Those things that you see from the pyramids that are shown on the calendar on the right edge there, from before that time all the way through, they were utilizing these sacred numbers, these measurements, and it's all based on the measurement of a man. You might want to, or you might have to go back and, if you don't now, write down these numbers and a few others, and it's going to be amazing to show you that that's contained in this, and in this, and in that, basically stretching across the idea of time itself and measurements that we concur with today.
The 1,440 minutes equates to 86,400 seconds. So if you just listen to these numbers, look at them, and let them kind of soak into your brain, once you've gotten into this as actually a system, a methodology of transmitting information, these numbers are actually carriers of information, because each number stands for meanings beyond just the apparent ones. So
they go with certain planets. They go with certain measurements that are supposed to equate in your mind, if you know about these things, to certain events or certain places, time, events. All these things can be trapped within the idea of them showing you a sacred geometry number. And so while they're in the Bible, which I'll use as an example here, do go through statements, and they use this number here that he just spoke of in a few different instances. Whenever you do so and they lay it out and everybody's there, and with Moses and Sinai and this concept that there's a whole sacred geometry that's going on with, among with many other things. So it's an incredible book. It really is, to have put all these things together. And what's odd is most of it that you see is unknown. Most of what you look at is a face value situation, instead of realizing that it contains more than one thing about this exact same statement. And they're correlating it to the moon, or the sun, or certain planets, or a constellation, or many things. Such a high number, 86,400, and that can be 8,640, or that could be 864,000. The amount of inflation that you give to the number based on putting an extra zero at the end does not change the value of what we're speaking of. It just gives another layer to it. You follow me? Let's continue here.
So we see 1,440 minutes is equal to 86,400 seconds, and a 12-hour span of time, which is usually represented on the clock, 720 minutes, which equals 43,200 seconds.
Now, this is all breaking it down somewhat, and a lot of people can realize that certain things are multiples of each other, and if you know your times table times 12, that'll really come out in handy. But other times, like I just spoke of, sometimes it's just to a factor of 10, and it doesn't change it at all. These numbers are going to show up over and over again, but it's not just 3. There are a lot more that are coming at you here. And so you might want to, with a pad, write down these numbers, because they're going to equate to something. You might want to give a couple of rows below each number. Just put a stripe next to it, and then equals, and then out to it you can write things for a few pages. This 43,200 or 432 or 432,000 is extremely important also, and you're going to see that reflected through this whole series, and see it in many different places. It's mind-boggling. And then here's another one, and then here's another one. And then here's another one. And you start to make connections. That's what this channel's about. So let's see if we can start making some.
So just look at those numbers. You'll think that obviously 43,200 is half of 86,400. The 1,440, we're going to encounter that number again here momentarily. So these are just examples of some of the time measures, how we think about time in our particular culture. Space measure, we talked about a foot. We talked about of 12 inches. We talked about a square foot. And you'll notice that the square foot has the same repetition of digits, 144, as the 24 hours does. All we do is we tack a 0 on that. We have the number of minutes in a day. We have the cubic foot equaling 1728. I want to call your attention to the 1 square yard, which is 1,296 inches. As it turns out, we can stick a 0 on the end of that, and we have 12,960 years, which turns out to be an awesomely important span of time in terms of some of the great cycles that affect this planet.
And you're going to see that too in this presentation. But notice that a square yard, and a yard is 3 foot. So there's that triplicate, which also is described in the Bible as 3 days, like Jesus was done for 3 days. So there are connections that go with this also. But that 1296 is going to become pretty important. You think 1728 is not, but it's a factor in there. But again, that 144, that idea of base 60, that secret number 12, and so on. And again, 12,960 becomes pretty important in not just a daily life cycle and so on, but actually the whole zodiacal swirl of time that we travel through, which is known as the great year.
And that's what we're going to be getting to. Geometry, everybody knows that a circumference of a circle is divided into 360 degrees, and that 360 degrees of arc, because each degree is subdivided into minutes of arc, there is then 60 times 360, as it says there, 21,600.
There's that number again. Now that 360 degrees also works with the Earth, the size and the shape of things, as well as time measurements, as well as things that are in front of you right now in measurements, in ratios, and so on. So we're going to see a lot of these things recreated. I know our year is 365 days. We'll talk about that here shortly, and how the Sumerians had compensated for that idea and yet come up with things that all connected, and the reason why.
And then you'll notice the 21,600 minutes of arc equals 1,296,000 seconds of arc. That's a mighty fine subdivision of a circle that would be used mostly by astronomers to measure the motion of distant stars. But notice that number, 1,296,000, and you'll see that it's the same number, just raised by 3 orders of magnitude as the number of square inches in a square yard.
So there are all kinds of connections that we're starting to make here. If you need to pause during this, go ahead. But I want you to just be ready for it. Like, hop in the car and we're fixing to go Zoom. So strap in and then get yourself ready, and then look over at me and take a good nod, because a lot of shit's going to go on in a short amount of time here. And again, I'm going to try to spread this out for you, break in, make connections, and so on. But do you notice here that that square inches that is shown there also is the seconds of arc that are in a whole day, and how this works with the cosmos. He talked about how this would be a small, finite thing to look at 1,296 or 1,296,000 seconds of arc that's figured around the circumference of our Earth. But they use this as a side note primer against other advanced maths to figure out exactly the size of the Earth, and they did it pretty darn good. We'll be showing that in pieces coming up. But catch these numbers here, write them down, put it in a few pages, write sacred geometry at the top of it, and you can start to fill in things. And once you make connections here, other than that, you can put little bubbles over next to it and connect it.
By 3 orders of magnitude as the number of square inches in a square yard. Okay, now another thing you might notice about most of these numbers from 1440 to 8640, 43200, 144, 1728, 36, 1296 is that they all Kabbalistically add up and reduce to the single digit 9. Notice?
This is a concept where things don't go past tens. Like that finger counting game that you hear of the Oriental people having. Well, ancient Sumerians did too. They used each digit that's on their 4 fingers using their thumb to count, and that shows you there's 12 of them. You look, each finger that you have has three digit spots or breakpoints in it, and then you end up having 4 fingers, so that ends up being 12. But the idea of sacred geometry, especially even when there used to be letters for the numbers, for this thing that we're looking at here is more Arabic, but understand that's the statement that he made earlier. Regardless of what speech you try to go to, you can go to Japan, you can go anywhere you want. 1 and 1 and 2, 3 and 3 is 6. Numbers are going to be the same. As I was speaking of earlier, there's this Aryan or Proto-Indo-European linguistics that cover a large swath of humanity. The only difference is Shemitic and Afro-Asiatic, or Hamitic as they used to call it. But this language of mathematics, no matter what you try to call it, it's the same thing. It's not a different language. They don't have a different word for it. Well, they would have a different word for numbers. But regardless of that effect, if I show you 5 sticks and then I add 2 more sticks, everybody knows that's 7. Although in a modern day, I've heard people say some foolish things about math and everything else, and it's racist because white people made it up. What? But notice that each one of these things, 1 and 4 is 5, 5 and 4 is 9, so that equals 9 in your top left-hand corner. When you go to 8640 there, 8 plus 6 is 10, plus 4 is 14. Well, no, 8 and 6 is 10, which is 0 and 1. And so you have 1 and 8. And 1 plus 8, because you go over 10 again, making 18, is 9, if you follow me. 4, 3, 2, what's that? Add them together, that's 9. 1728, yeah, that's 9. 360, or the base of it, 36. What is that? 6 times 6 is 36, right? That's always one of the ones that sticks in your head whenever you learn your math tables and so on, for a reason. But 3 and 6 is 9. 1296 adds up to 9 too. So how many layers of sacred geometry do they have here whenever they have it go on, and what it connects to, and how they're perfect numbers and all of these situations? Well, it also went with words. I'll show you that coming up.
Percent all of them. Pick any one of them, other than, say, with the exception of 24, but 1440 adds and reduces to a single digit 9. 1296, you'll notice the same thing. 1 and 2 and 9 and 6 is 18, which adds to a 9. Okay, so if you're taking notes, write these down or make mental notes of these numbers, because these are the numbers we're going to be encountering now as we progress through this journey here into the hidden mathematics.
And it's going to be in the angles of things, and yet be in the measurements of things, and yet be in the distance of times of things. And it starts to get this 3-fold, 4-fold, 5th dimension type thing going on. It's incredible.
So we will start by looking at how some of these same numbers and other numbers are associated with the measures of geometry.
Simplistic. You had this toy when you were a kid, and it had little holes in it that you could fit different ones in. And I know the trick that you could fit a triangle through the square one. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about perfect measures that we have today, something that's given to you whenever you're just teething as a concept. But people don't explain the concept behind it, and they sure don't try to do it to real young kids. But it's amazing when we get up into school, whenever they should be learning something like this, that's just thrown out. Just like you used to have to know Greek and so on too, but now that's kind of thrown out too. Good thing we didn't throw out this measuring system that we've had since primordial time and go with the metric system. Sure, it's great to go with the metric system. It works off the speed of light and so on like that. That's fantastic. That can be utilized in certain ways, and you can find special things in that too in representations. But this one was based and built on it to everything to the nth degree.
And here we have what I refer to as the alphabet of sacred geometry, and these are the simplest forms. These are the polygons. You have a circle, which is actually not a polygon, but we have an equilateral triangle, a square, and a pentagon. And each of these can be measured by the number of degrees that determine the angles of the sides. So for example, we look at a circle, which is just a special case of an ellipse with eccentricity of 0. We've covered this already, so let's go right to the equilateral triangle, and we'll see it's 60, 60, and 60, which equals 180 degrees. Again, notice that we've got the number 9 recurring. We go to the square, which is 4 times 9.
And again, notice that there was a 666 in that, and that the pyramid is related to the sun. We'll get there eventually on that, but let's look at these sizes and angles. Most people know that when you take a right angle, like what the square made out of, that it's 90 degrees, 90 degrees. Have you ever heard of squaring the circle? Well, that's the same thing. A square can be a circle can be a square. That's why it's utilized that way. You know, when you use a compass, go around 360 degrees, break it down, things like that.
90 degrees, the total number of degrees defining the square is 360, the same as the circle, the same as the measure of a circle. And we measure the polygons by essentially measuring the angles of the vertices or the corners. So then likewise with the pentagon, each of the angles between successive edges is 108 degrees.
Now, because we're headed towards Halloween, I'll break in and show you something, and he'll say something about it here in a minute, but 108 is a lunar number. And you remember that the moon was hooked up with the pentagram for all the devil worshiping stuff and all the stuff that's kind of like this whenever you're a kid, supposedly. Well, that all goes together. In fact, the pentagon is the center of that devil star. And oh my gosh, with its normal representation like this, the point is pointing down. Yeah, so that's that goat head, and everything. What's that got to do with it all? Well, that's astrotheological. It doesn't have anything to do with Satan. Imagine going around thinking goats are bad. Let's continue.
So you multiply the 108 times 5 and you get 540. Again, notice, everything adds up to 9. For some strange reason. 108 is going to turn out to be a very important number. It's a lunar number, as you're going to see. 108, anybody know what metal has an atomic weight of silver?
Oops.
Atomic weight of 108? Yes, that's right, it's silver.
So, was it last year, Halloween, or the year before, I ended up showing you why silver is supposed to be against the werewolves and all of those things? That you have to use a silver bullet and everything. What's that go with? That all goes back to this concept here. And that silver's to do with the moon, and the moon is the one that causes it. So there's their moon's bane, metallic, silver. And I'm not telling you that the people knew the atomic weight of things, but everything starts to fit together and you're like, what? Well, that watt is just a 1 watt. Wait a minute, there's going to be enough watts to light a heavy light bulb here shortly over time. And it keeps unfolding on itself. It's amazing.
Very good. All right, so let's get into some of the solid. Tetrahedron is this form right here. And it's composed of 4 of the equilateral triangles. So we have, as it says here, there's 4 triangular faces. 4 times 180 is 720 degrees.
That also equals 9, by the way. Doesn't it look like a pyramid? Well, when you do it like this, it doesn't look like the pyramids that you think of. Those are more flattened out to 51.8 degrees. But this one here looks a lot like the other pyramids that you see, and all the ones that were up in Kush that were made by the Egyptians that used to rule over Kush. Look up viceroys of Kush, it'll tell you who ruled over the time. Take a look in any of those tombs and they're showing you pale women, red ochre men, the Egyptian gods and so on. It was later repurposed somewhat. The Kushites that you would think of as the Kushites used to actually make a different type of barrow for their burials and not the same thing at all. Although in a modern day a bunch of BS is said about it, or try to pimp somebody out as if they did something whenever during that time they were being domesticated by the Egyptians. And of course, East African people, like what we call the Nubians, aren't even related to the Khoisan or the Pygmies or anybody else in Africa, much less than the West Sub-Saharans that didn't even know Egypt existed, and they're the ones that keep claiming this. But let's continue here. You're going to notice that all of these shapes are conspicuously the shapes of dice that you use in Dungeons and Dragons. That game that I sometimes show you videos and stuff of and everything, and how it's got connections with all of these ancient stories and mythologies. Yeah, these are them. There's a 4-sided dice. There's a 6-sided dice, which is the square we all know, 8-sided dice, 12-sided dice, and even a 20-sided dice, the icosahedron. Each one giving you somewhat percentage chances, and you yourself have percentage chances due to who you are and what all you have. Not to go deep into it or whatever, but then wherever you roll versus your dexterity to see if you can make that jump or do these things, you have to roll versus that, and the percentages there are already in front of you in the dice. Hope you don't make a bad roll, right? 720, 7 and 2 is 9.
Is the total angular measure of this particular geometric form. This is known as one of the platonic solids, or regular polyhedra. Polyhedra means multiple faces, and the regular polyhedra is the family of 5, there's only 5, that have the same shape or the same polygonal face. In this case, the equilateral triangle. And
it uses triangles and pentagrams, which pentagrams are based off triangles. For each pentagram side is where a triangle is being made. So we have that situation going on here, but then there are perfect shapes, and these are the ancient Pythagorean shapes and stuff of matter itself. So now we're talking about how sacred geometry goes into the making of matter itself and everything else. It gets deep.
And then we will move on to the cube, and the cube is 6 faces, and they're each square, and we saw that each of those square faces had 360 degrees, 6 times 360. The important thing is to grasp that the total number of degrees in this form is 2,160. 2,160. And we're going to find out that that number actually turns out to be pretty significant in the measure of other parts of time and space.
And that's another mind blower I'm talking about. You can see this was filmed whenever he's actually teaching a class on this. And you can see by his hair here versus if you've seen Randall here lately, that he's grayed somewhat in age. And this is, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago or somewhat. But I used to say he's slowly turning into Zeus, or Zeus Santa Claus. And lo and behold, yeah, it's come to fruition in these days.
Then we'll go to the octahedron, and it has 8 triangular faces. This is our octahedron right here. And they're all, you'll notice that so far the tetrahedron and the octahedron are both composed of triangular, equilateral triangular faces. And essentially, if you look at the difference between the tetrahedron and the octahedron, you could just imagine it if we could take the tetrahedron and split it along an edge and insert a 4th triangular face, it would cause it to flatten out somewhat, and it would give us the top half of the octahedron.
Which looks more like the Great Pyramid, as opposed to the Nubian pyramids and so on. Or the bent pyramid, which was starting off to be built like the one he showed a minute ago with more pointy effects like I was speaking of, and then it changed to something much more indirect. Almost like what that shows is something like a D&D dice shoved in and buried under the sand, and all you're seeing is the top two angular forms. Perhaps we'll see a little of that later.
And likewise, we could insert a fifth equilateral triangle in here, and it's going to give us the icosahedron, which I'll show you in a minute. If we tried to insert a sixth one, though, we discovered that the whole thing flattened out into 2 dimensions. So that wouldn't work as far as enclosing space. So Nate?
So that's another amazing fact too, that it flattens all out into 2 dimensions, so it's all that you can get out of that one form and the way that it works. But then all the things that are associated with each one of these forms, it's amazing. Air, earth, water, fire, elements, the elements themselves too. So it starts to be multifolding here. And again, here are these numbers.
In any case, notice we're seeing a recurrence of this number that we saw, 1440. Remember, we saw that number back, right here, the number of minutes in a day. So let that relationship sink in. The number of minutes in the time that it takes our Earth to spin exactly once on its axis relative to the sun happens to be the same number of degrees that define the octahedron.
It's also showing you there, it's the square minutes of a day. But if we look just a hair lower, it's also the cubits that are in the holy city that's written of in your